My name is Kennedy Walsh, 34 years old, Lieutenant Commander in the United States Navy, and tonight at my sister's wedding, my father called me the Special Ops Janitor. The words slid off his tongue smooth as bourbon. His friends, men with their class rings shining like armor, laughed the way people do when cruelty is dressed as a joke. It landed on me like a bruise pressed deeper. We were under a white tent by the river, strings of Edison bulbs humming, champagne flutes catching the light. Claire wanted me in dress whites for her photographs. I said yes, because it was her day, because I've learned to fold my edges in when family fills a room. Dad stood at the bar, voice booming like it used to when orders were law. He raised his glass. I mirrored him, a salute I didn't owe. Then a boy's voice cracked through the music. "Oh my God, is that her?" Heads turned, screens lit, and there I was on a stage in Washington, ribbon at my collar, a caption under my name. A moment I never meant to explain tonight, suddenly glowing across the room. The air shifted. My father's hand twitched. The stem slipped. Glass shattered against the polished floor, and silence spread, sharp and electric, as eyes flicked between the phones and me. I had come here ready to smile through his dismissal one more time, but the truth was already walking through the tent, unstoppable. If you've ever been mocked by someone you love, if you've ever waited for the moment the truth would finally speak louder than the lies, stay with me. Because as the shards glittered at my father's feet, I still hadn't moved. Because as the shards glittered at my father's feet, I still hadn't moved. The silence pressed close, humming louder than the band, heavier than the scent of champagne. My sister's laughter floated across the tent, bright and easy, veil catching in the river breeze. She had no idea the air inside had cracked wide open. I stood there, spine locked, knowing I had been here before, not in a tent full of strangers, but in the crosshairs of his voice. It wasn't new. He'd been cutting me down in public for years. I remember the kitchen table when I was 19, enlistment papers spread between us. He read them, leaned back, and smirked. "So you'll be the one keeping the lights on for the real guys?" My mother stirred her coffee without looking up. Claire bit her lip, waiting for me to protest. Instead, I laughed. Easier than explaining. That laugh turned into a habit. A tight smile I wore whenever he needed an audience. Over time, it became muscle memory, a mask I could slip on before the blade dropped. For him, worth was measured in dirt and sweat, boots on hostile ground, rifles slung across shoulders. If your job didn't leave mud on your uniform, it didn't count. Intelligence? Logistics? Shadows? Background noise? I was background noise in a uniform he barely acknowledged. At reunions, he'd tell relatives I kept the air conditioning running for the real men. They'd chuckle politely. I'd nod, pretending it didn't slice me open. And yet I kept chasing approval like it was oxygen. If I pushed harder, if I made it through deployment after deployment, maybe he'd see me differently. But hope wears thin. Every cycle ended the same, his voice asking if I'd done anything real. The truth is, the most dangerous work never makes headlines. You don't get medals for arranging supply drops that keep people alive, or for drawing up extraction routes that means someone else gets to come home. You just keep doing it, because the alternative is folded flags. But that kind of truth was invisible to him. Tonight, under this glowing canopy, he'd cut me one more time, and I'd told myself I was ready. I thought I could swallow it. I'd pressed my uniform, shined my shoes, fixed a smile for Claire's photographs. I believed I could carry whatever weight he handed me. But the video shifted everything. The glow of those phones was like a storm front rolling in. Suddenly, the truth wasn't mine to hide. I walked slowly toward my seat near the head table, heels biting into the grass, every step measured. Around me, voices flickered in low tones. Not the real Navy. Paper pusher. Special ops janitor. They didn't even whisper it with malice, just casual dismissal, like the words were fact. Each laugh was short, sharp, cruel in its ease. I sat down, fork hovering above my untouched plate, and let the toasts begin. Glasses clinked, voices rose, stories of love and luck washing over me. I I smiled at the right times, but inside I replayed his voice, the way he leaned into janitor like a punchline he'd been saving. A waiter refilled my water, the glass rippling under the string lights. For a second, I thought of another ripple, 18 months earlier, half a world away. No champagne, no music. Just the hum of outdated servers and the smell of burnt coffee in a converted warehouse near the Pacific. That's where I'd spent 72 hours trying to solve a problem no one wanted to admit was unsolvable. 2 officers had vanished off the southern edge of the Philippine Sea, last transmission cut mid-sentence. Intel whispered they were trapped in a fishing village tied to a militia. Time was bleeding away. My job wasn't to kick down doors. It was to give the people who could every chance of making it out alive. That meant cloaking comms inside chatter about tides, finding a vessel that could hug coastline beneath radar, arranging aerial refueling in the dead of night. Then a typhoon warning came. Half the room wanted to scrub. I argued storms cut both ways. Yes, dangerous, but perfect cover. We pushed supplies through the storm's edge on a beat-up cargo plane, forged manifests tucked with medical kits and extraction harnesses. Hours later, the comms crackled alive. Package secure. My chest collapsed in relief. The report was 3 pages. My name appeared once. 2 weeks later, I was back stateside, sitting across from my father at his kitchen table. He asked if I'd done anything interesting. I said no, because in this line of work, the win isn't the story you get to tell. It's the people who get to go home. Now here I was, under a wedding tent strung with light, the truth seeping out on tiny glowing screens. People who had chuckled minutes earlier were staring at me like they'd misread the script. My father's voice rose at the bar, that booming timbre meant to command. I didn't need to hear the words. I already knew them. He would spin me into a caricature, like always. Only this time, the silence in the room said otherwise. I pressed my palms flat on the table, eyes catching on the cake knife gleaming under the bulbs. Claire was still laughing, still radiant. She had no idea the air around her had turned to glass, brittle and waiting to shatter. I told myself I wouldn't be the one to break it. I would sit here, smile, let the truth do the work. But the band shifted tempo, the chatter faltered, and I felt the tide turning. One by one, heads angled toward me. Conversations thinned into quiet. My chest tightened. My father stood frozen, shards glittering at his feet, the easy grin gone. And I knew the silence wouldn't last. Something was about to give, and I was right at the center of it. Something was about to give, and I was right at the center of it. The silence after the glass shattered didn't fade. It thickened. It wrapped around me like humidity before a storm, every eye flicking back and forth between the glowing phones and the man at the bar who no longer smiled. I didn't move. Years of training had drilled restraint into my muscles, and restraint was the only weapon I had now. The band tried to keep playing, sliding into an upbeat number, but the saxophone faltered and the notes came out brittle. Conversations restarted in half sentences, then died again. I could feel the recalibration in the air, the moment when people reassess what they thought they knew. A woman at the next table leaned in, whispering too loud, "Is that really her?" I breathed slow, hands resting flat on the tablecloth. This wasn't combat, but it felt like a standoff. No one had asked me for a speech. No one had demanded an explanation. But their silence did, and in that silence I could hear every echo of the past. The small humiliations, the quiet dismissals, the years of jokes delivered with a grin. My father's voice carried in my head even when he wasn't speaking. Not real, not enough. I thought of the long nights when I built missions from scraps. Cheap gear, bad intel, weather stacked against us. The victories were measured in lives that came home, never in headlines. And here, in this tent, all of it balanced on the edge of a phone screen. A boy's curiosity had dragged into the light what I had carried in the dark for years. I caught Claire's eyes for a moment. She waved from across the tent, still beaming, unaware. Her world tonight was filled with love and dancing and photographs. I wanted to keep it that way. So I smiled back, even as my pulse hammered, even as the whispers spread like static. I sat perfectly still, but inside, my thoughts were moving fast. I remembered the officers we pulled out of that fishing village, the way the storm had hidden us. I remembered how close we came to losing them. The report had been nothing. 3 pages, my name once. But those men were alive. Somewhere tonight they were breathing, laughing maybe, because of a plan no one here would ever read. And then I remembered the kitchen table, his voice, his smirk. "Did you do anything interesting?" Always the same question and always my same answer. No, because the truth was never mine to say out loud. Now the truth was in everyone's hands, pixelated, captioned, undeniable. At the bar, my father shifted. He picked up another glass, but his hand hesitated before he raised it. He scanned the crowd as if trying to measure what they were thinking. His laugh, the one that had filled parade grounds, was gone. In its place was something I hadn't seen before. A pause. I took that pause and held it. I didn't rush. I didn't rise. I let the silence do the work. But my mind was racing. What happens next? Do I stand? Do I speak? Do I let them draw their own conclusions from a 15-second video clip? What happens when the questions start? The first one came quiet, tentative. "Lieutenant Commander Walsh?" A man near the head table, his voice soft but carrying. "Is that really you?" Dozens of heads turned in unison. It was the shift I'd been waiting for and dreading at the same time. The moment the silence could no longer contain itself. My body moved before I could second guess. I pushed my chair back, the scrape loud in the hush. I stood, steady, hands relaxed at my sides. "It's me," I said. 2 words, simple. My voice didn't shake. My heart pounded, but I had trained for this kind of moment. Not the medals, not the recognition, but the clarity of standing still while everything moved around me. A ripple went through the crowd. Some nodded, some whispered, some just stared. My father didn't move. His jaw was set, his gaze locked, as if he could will the shards at his feet back together. I didn't launch into a speech. I didn't owe them details, but I felt the weight of the question in the room, the unspoken, "What did you do?" And I knew I couldn't leave it unanswered forever. So I gave them the simplest version. "I did my job," I said. The words landed clean. Sometimes that job takes you places you can't talk about, places where you make decisions fast and pray you made the right ones. There was a murmur, a shift. Not applause, not yet, but the sound of minds turning over. At the back of the tent, an older man in a Navy cap stood. His hand rose crisp, sharp, a salute. Reflex kicked in before I thought. I returned it. The gesture snapped something loose in the room. Chairs scraped, glasses lifted. The MC's voice tried to smooth the edges. "Well," he said, light but careful, "looks like we have someone very special among us tonight." He raised his glass. "To Lieutenant Commander Walsh." The toast rolled through the tent, some voices hesitant, others firm. I lifted my glass too, but my eyes were on my father. He hadn't moved. He hadn't spoken. His face was carved stone. And in that stillness, I felt the twist of it. This wasn't the apology I'd once dreamed of. This wasn't him admitting he'd been wrong. This was something else, a recognition he couldn't control, a truth he couldn't bury. The room found its rhythm again, softer now. Laughter returned, but thinner, threaded with glances in my direction. I caught Claire spinning in her gown, radiant, untouched. That was what I wanted, for her to keep her joy. So I slipped outside. The night air was cooler, carrying salt from the river. Strings of bulbs swayed between the trees. I breathed deep, steadying myself, the tension loosening for the first time all evening. And that's when I felt a tug at my sleeve. The boy, the one who had started it all without knowing. He looked sheepish, eyes down. "I didn't mean to embarrass you," he mumbled. "My uncle's special ops. I've heard the stories. Seeing you like that, I just didn't think people like you existed in the Navy." I crouched slightly, met his eyes. "What you saw on TV, that's one moment. What matters most is what no one sees. The work you do when no one's watching. That's what keeps people alive." He nodded slowly, absorbing it. And in that nod, I saw the echo of what I'd always wanted from my father. Not applause, just understanding. I turned back toward the tent, toward the music swelling again, toward my sister spinning under the lights. My father was still inside, laughing with an old friend like nothing had shifted. Maybe for him it hadn't. Maybe it never would. But for me, something had. Because tonight, for the first time, the truth had spoken louder than his laugh. And I knew this was only the beginning. This was only the beginning. I knew it the moment I stepped back under the tent lights. The air hadn't cleared. It had only shifted. Conversations restarted, but they carried a new edge. Some voices softened, others sharpened, and I could feel myself being measured in real time. Not for who I was, but for how much of me they believed. My sister twirled on the dance floor, laughter like bells, but around the edges of the tent, whispers thickened. I caught fragments when I passed near clusters of guests. Must have been exaggerated. They give medals for paperwork now? Special ops logistics. What does that even mean? Every word was a small cut, and there was no way to block them all. I had thought the video would silence doubt. Instead, it had cracked the door open for a different kind of judgment. People saw what they wanted to see. Some recalibrated, others doubled down. I slipped into my chair again, glass in hand, and forced myself to breathe evenly. The shards of my father's glass had been swept away, but the space where it had shattered still felt sharp underfoot. I looked toward him. He was smiling again, laughing with an old army buddy, as if nothing had shifted at all. His ability to reset, to reclaim the narrative, was relentless. It struck me like a gut punch. He wasn't going to break, not tonight. For a moment, I thought I could fade back into the background, let the reception find its rhythm without me. But then the MC leaned too heavily into his toast, voice bright and performative. To Lieutenant Commander Walsh, our own hero. The word rang false, too loud, too forced, and I saw eyes cut to me again. Applause scattered, awkward. The music swelled but didn't cover it. Heat climbed up my neck. This wasn't what I wanted. I never asked for a spotlight here. I had wanted quiet, wanted Claire's wedding unbroken. And yet, I was standing in the center of something I couldn't control. A cousin leaned across the table, her voice edged with curiosity. So, what exactly did you do out there? Was it dangerous? I smiled tight, shook my head. I did my job. But the questions kept coming. Did you carry a weapon? Were you in combat? Did you ever kill anyone? The words hit harder than bullets because they revealed the truth. Even with the proof glowing on their phones, they didn't understand. Maybe they never would. I excused myself, pushing back from the table, steps measured, pulse racing. I slipped out the side of the tent and into the humid night air, the river smell sharp, the cicadas loud in the trees. Out here, the lights didn't press so hard, and I could finally breathe. But the silence followed me, the weight of every eye, every whisper. My chest felt tight, not from shame, but from the futility of it all. I had spent years carrying truths I couldn't share, wins that could never be celebrated. And tonight, even when the truth finally surfaced, it still wasn't enough. I leaned against a tree, bark rough under my palm, and closed my eyes. For a moment, I was back in that warehouse, monitors flickering, storm bands curling across satellite feeds. The smell of coffee, the static of failing comms, the gnawing fear that we were already too late. Those 72 hours had nearly broken me. And yet, standing here, it felt like none of it mattered. Not to him, not to the ones that's still whispering about real service. The failure settled heavy. Not the missions, not the work. I had saved lives. I knew that. But the dream that somewhere along the line my father might finally see me. That dream was dead tonight. The evidence was glowing on every phone, and still he laughed with his buddies, unmoved. I pushed off the tree, straightened my shoulders, and walked back toward the tent. Inside, the music had picked up. Couples spinning under the lights, laughter spilling louder now, as if forcing joy to smother the tension. I slid back into the edges of the crowd, unseen but not unnoticed. Heads still angled, whispers still spread. I held my face neutral, but inside, something was breaking. The MC called for the cake cutting. Claire and her husband stepped forward, smiles wide, hands linked on the knife. Flashbulbs burst, cousins cheered. I stayed seated, clapping politely, swallowing the tightness in my throat. This was supposed to be her moment, but the truth was, my presence had already altered the night, and I couldn't take it back. My father drifted closer, settling into a circle of men near the cake. His voice carried again, too familiar, too practiced. I didn't hear the words, but I knew the tone. The same tone he'd used my entire life. Commanding, mocking, owning the room. And that's when the realization hit harder than any dismissal. This wasn't a battle I could win tonight. The truth might be undeniable, but he would always find a way to shrug it off, to laugh, to reframe. And the others, the ones who whispered, would follow his lead. It was a loss I felt in my bones, not of respect, not of recognition, but of hope. The fragile thread I had carried for years, that someday he would stop undercutting me, that someday his laugh would turn into pride, snapped clean. I sat back, letting the sounds of celebration wash over me, tasting the bitterness in the back of my throat. The night moved on, music and lights and laughter resuming as though nothing had cracked. But inside, I was carrying shards sharper than the glass that had fallen at his feet. And I knew this. Something would have to change, but not here, not tonight. Something would have to change, but not here, not tonight. That's what I told myself as the music swelled, as Claire and her new husband cut the cake, as laughter strained to patch the fractures running through the tent. But change doesn't wait for permission. It doesn't ask if the timing is right. It comes when silence finally breaks, and silence in that room was already cracking like glass under too much weight. The first fissure was subtle, eyes darting, conversations stuttering. Phones still glowed, screens still passed hand to hand, the video refusing to disappear. My father's voice tried to fill the air again, his laugh too loud, his war stories too polished. Back in the Gulf, when real men... The cadence was familiar, the script unchanged. I could have mouthed the words along with him, but the laughter was thin, scattered. Some chuckled out of loyalty, others dropped their gaze to the blue-white light in their palms. His grip on the room was loosening, and he felt it. I could see it in the way his shoulders squared, in the flash of irritation across his jaw. And then the question rose, soft but clear, cutting through the clink of glasses. Lieutenant Commander Walsh, what was the mission? It came from a man near the head table, his tone steady, respectful, but loud enough to halt forks midair. The music faltered again. Dozens of eyes shifted toward me. They weren't looking at him anymore. They were looking at me. My chair scraped loud as I stood. The sound sliced through the quiet, commanding attention I hadn't asked for but couldn't avoid. My heart pounded in my chest. But my hands stayed loose at my sides. The mission, I said, voice carrying steady, was to bring our people home, and we did. No details, no embellishment, just the truth, pared down to what mattered. A ripple ran through the room. Some nodded, others murmured. I saw the retired Coast Guard officer at the back lean forward, his weathered face intent. He cleared his throat, voice firm. Those operations, they don't hand out medals for busy work. She earned it. His words rang with authority, the kind that couldn't be brushed off. The air shifted again. People leaned in, recalibrating. For the first time, I felt the current pulling toward me. That's when my father moved. He stepped out of his circle, closer, eyes fixed on me. She's overselling it, he said, loud enough to carry. His tone was sharp, stripped of humor. She kept the lights on, that's all. Gasps rippled. Claire froze mid-laugh on the dance floor, veil suspended in a draft. Even the MC's smile faltered. I could have swallowed it like always, could have let it pass, packed it into another mental box to store with the rest. But something broke free in me. The years of silence, of polite nods, of tight smiles, they cracked. I squared my shoulders, lifted my chin. You call it lights, I said, each word deliberate, but without those lights, your men never make it back alive. The sentence landed like a strike. The crowd stilled. His jaw tightened. He stepped closer until only a few feet separated us, until the space between us felt like a drawn bowstring. "You think logistics makes you a soldier?" His voice was low but cutting. I didn't flinch. "I think saving lives makes me more than a punchline." It was the first time I had ever said it out loud, and once it was spoken, it couldn't be unsaid. Whispers rippled around us. Some nodded, some exchanged startled looks. Claire's eyes shone with tears, though she didn't move. My mother sat stiff at her table, hands clasped, gaze down. The MC hovered near the microphone, uncertain. The band fell completely silent, instruments slack in their hands. The tent had become a courtroom, a battlefield, and I was standing center stage. My father opened his mouth again, but before he could speak, the boy, the same teenager who had started all of this, piped up from near the dessert table. His voice cracked, but his words were strong. "I saw the video. She's a hero." Heads turned. A teenager had broken the line no one else dared cross, and his voice, unpracticed and raw, struck harder than any toast. The Coast Guard officer seized the moment. He rose, glass lifted high, his voice booming. "To Lieutenant Commander Walsh, who brought her people home." Glasses rose across the tent. Chairs scraped as people stood. The toast spread table to table, louder, firmer, undeniable. I lifted my glass too, though my eyes stayed locked on my father. He didn't raise his. He didn't move. His hand was empty, his face pale with fury. The toast ended, but the weight of it lingered. The room had turned. For once, I wasn't the fringe of his story. I was the center of my own. He leaned in close, his voice a hiss, meant for me alone. "They'll forget this tomorrow. They'll go back to my version." I met his stare, steady. "Maybe, but I won't." We stood locked in silence, the noise of the tent swelling around us, music returning, laughter rising, Claire's veil spinning as she twirled once more. The celebration stitched itself back together, but the rip couldn't be mended completely. Not after what had been said, not after what had been seen. I stayed standing a moment longer, then eased back into my chair, pulse still pounding. People came by one. A woman in a floral dress touched my shoulder, whispered, "Thank you for your service." A man I barely knew nodded with quiet respect. Even strangers looked at me differently. No longer background, no longer invisible. But my father, he stayed rooted, stiff as stone, surrounded by his old comrades, trying to laugh, trying to reset. Only now the laughter didn't carry. It rang hollow, thin, unable to drown out what had already taken place. I knew then, this wasn't the apology I'd once craved. This wasn't pride or reconciliation. This was something else. I had stood my ground, and he hadn't been able to crush it with a joke. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time in my life, his voice hadn't been the last word. The night pushed on. Claire danced. Guests clapped. The saxophone picked up again, its notes brighter, lighter, as though trying to sweep away the heaviness. But underneath, the shift remained. People recalibrated, reassessed. And I sat with my glass, steady now, feeling the new balance. Because tonight I had answered back. Tonight, for the first time, he hadn't written my story. And I knew this confrontation wasn't the end. It was the turning point. It was the turning point. I felt it in the way the tent exhaled after the toast, the way conversations picked up again, but not quite the same. Something had shifted, and no matter how my father laughed or how hard the band played, the echo of what had happened stayed in the air. I sat at my table, hands wrapped around the stem of a glass, letting the sounds of celebration wash over me. Claire was radiant, spinning in her gown, veil catching in the breeze each time she twirled. Her husband's smile was wide, easy. This was their night, and no matter what had flared between me and my father, I wanted to keep it that way. People drifted toward me as the evening wore on. Some offered words, soft, careful. "Thank you for your service." "Didn't know you'd done all that." "We're proud to have you here tonight." I nodded, smiled when I could, kept my answers short. I didn't need their applause. What mattered was the quiet recalibration in their eyes, the way they saw me now without the filter of my father's laugh. Eventually, I slipped outside again, past the glowing bulbs strung between the trees. The night air was cool, carrying the salt of the nearby river. The cicadas hummed steady, grounding. Out here, the weight in my chest finally eased. That's when I felt it, a gentle tug at my sleeve. I turned, and there he was, the boy who had started it all without knowing. His navy blue suit was still too big, sleeves swallowing his wrists. He looked up at me, nervous, eyes flicking to the ground before he spoke. "I didn't mean to embarrass you," he said. His voice cracked, but he kept going. "My uncle's special ops. I've heard stories all my life. And when I saw you on that stage, I didn't think people like you existed in the Navy." I crouched so our eyes were level. His were wide, earnest, searching. "What you saw on TV, that's just one moment," I told him. "The part that matters most? It's the work no one sees, the decisions you make when no one's clapping. That's the part that keeps people alive." He nodded slowly, like he was folding the words into himself. I knew that look. I'd worn it once, sitting at a kitchen table with a man who would never understand. But maybe this boy would. When I stood again, I glanced back through the flap of the tent. My father was laughing with one of his old army friends, easy grin back in place as if nothing had shifted. Maybe for him, nothing had. Maybe it never would. And for the first time, I realized that was fine, because tonight had never been about changing him. Tonight had been about standing without doubt in who I was. I stepped back into the tent, letting the warmth and music fold around me. The band was brighter now, guests filling the dance floor, Claire radiant in the center of it all. The shards of my father's glass had long been swept away, the floor gleaming again as though it had never cracked. But I knew better. Some breaks you can polish over, others stay, invisible but real. I wasn't the janitor he imagined, but if being one meant cleaning up chaos so that my people came home alive, then I would take the title gladly. You don't always get the apology you want. You don't always get the recognition you think you deserve. Sometimes the win is quieter, harder to see. It's living in a way that makes the truth undeniable, even if only a handful of people ever really understand. And tonight, the truth had already taken its place in the room. It had settled into the silence after the glass broke, into the ripple of a boy's voice, into the lift of glasses in a toast I never asked for. It had settled into me. I stood near the edge of the dance floor, watching Claire laugh, watching guests sway under the glow of the Edison bulbs. My father's voice rose again somewhere behind me, but it no longer carried the weight it once did. I didn't need it to. Because the mission had never been to silence him. The mission was to hold the line, to carry the weight, to keep faith with the people who counted on me, even when they never knew my name. And as the night rolled on, as music lifted higher and laughter blended with the river air, I felt the kind of calm you only find after storms, the kind you don't earn by winning a fight, but by standing long enough to know you didn't fall. So if you've ever been dismissed by someone you love, if you've ever swallowed words until your chest ached, if you've ever waited for the day when truth finally outshines mockery, remember this: you don't always need them to see you. You only need to stand steady in who you are. That's the lesson I carried out of that tent in Savannah, under strings of white lights and the sound of a wedding band trying to play us all into joy. And maybe that's the lesson you need too. Because sooner or later, the truth walks into the room, glowing bright enough that no laugh, no dismissal, no broken glass can cover it again.